Hi, everyone. David Fazzino here, and I'd like to thank Kevin for the invitation to present a little bit on my book and its, I think, relevance to what you folks are doing and have done and have lived over your lifetime. The new book that I have out here is Historic Takings in Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. And the key centerpiece of this is talking to various folks that have been displaced by the Army Corps of Engineers as well as the National Park Service. So it looks at oral history basically since the 1960s when the National Park Service started gathering some of this information, and then throughout the 2010s when I started gathering the information. So it traces back a lot of the history and memories of the place that is now Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, and that many of you know in very different ways. So you might recognize me from earlier, perhaps with a little bit more hair and a tan. I'm not sure here, but that's me in one of the earlier meetings. So the book, which just came out in July, basically, the chapters are laid out as follows. I start by taking a look at property in place in Delaware Water Gap. So thinking about what land ownership means, what place means for people, what it means for me, and then situating that in the context of law. In chapter 2, I look at the broader policy in American conservation and preservation in the United States. Chapter 3 looks at the initial inhabitants of the area, so indigenous peoples, Native Americans of the area, and the takings that occurred there. From there, we get into the development of the Upper Minisink or the Valley by early settlers, and then what they basically make of their homesteads, farms, and how history marches on. And people contribute to the place, and then you have the ancestors who've also contributed to the place. The descendants then are left to have the consequences of the government coming in and procuring the property. So that's the highlights in chapter 5, and I'll take a couple excerpts from the book and sort of highlight some of the rich feelings that people had for this process overall. In chapter 6, I basically conclude with looking at the park and surrounding communities today, with a particular focus on historic preservation of buildings, including Wheat Plains Farm. So the Delaware Water Gap, as many of you know, are 70,000 acres in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Now, I grew up on the Pennsylvania side, so I saw a lot less evidence of historic buildings and structures. There were only a few of these. There were very little, it was very little in terms of interpretive signs to direct me towards realizing the full extent to which the government came in and basically took property from people that had lived in the valley going back sometimes hundreds of years. So the 70,000 acres offers lots of recreational opportunities, and that's the way the park is designed. It's designed basically as the river as a primary resource. So dating back to the early or late 1800s, when you had a lot of folks coming from New York City by train and then by stagecoach. And that's actually highlighted in the book too, where people are talking about that in terms of their memories of how people were coming into the area and exploring the area. So what gets left out a lot of times with the park management is that the historic structures and the people that lived in those structures and the lives that were lived. And of course, me growing up in the area, I didn't see a lot of that. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to write this book and pursue this research overall. In the American movements for conservation and preservation, this really shaped, I think, the way that the Park Service is now managing the land, and it also shapes the way that individuals view land. Does it exist for people, as Gifford Pinchot thought, Milford Native, Gray Towers, National Forest Service, or should there be these cathedrals that are set aside? And basically, John Muir's idea was that this was for city folk that needed to come to the country to basically re-energize themselves from living the rushing life of the city overall. So preservation and conservation play out, and these both get the ear of Teddy Roosevelt, who makes various decisions about land use throughout the United States. and that helps to shape how federal land is managed today. So in 1955, as many of you are likely aware, there was this massive flood on the Delaware. Of course, this was nothing new. In my book, I talk about floods from the early 1900s that were actually worse. Of course, there's a lot more infrastructure during the 1955 flood that is right in the flood zone. So, and that is mostly downriver from the valley. And so a lot of these justifications to build the dam are coming from outside of the valley itself. And so the Tocks Island Dam, the Tocks Island National Recreation Area, this was to be an earthen dam across Tocks Island. When it first started, Nancy Shakaitis talked about the idea that, well, we're going to build this dam potentially in Walpack. And so the Army Corps of Engineers actually came out and they said, well, you can have the dam at Walpack, or you can have the dam Walpack Bend or at Tocks Island. And so Nancy, in thinking about this, well, the choice is A or B, not you can't have the dam at all. So she basically told me, and others, I think this was an interview actually with National Park Service folks, that she had just assumed that the dam was going to be put in, and that was that, and that the federal government knew best. And as she continued her research into the dam, she found out that, in fact, the federal government did not know best, and of course the dam was never built. And so the area gets viewed as a wilderness area, and this is the idea that there's land that's set aside, basically John Muir's idea of preservation, right? So the Wilderness Act, where humans are only visitors, and they come in and leave, and then they leave no trace. And this is, I think, a lot of ways what, at least my experience on the Pennsylvania side of the park, was what the National Park Service was going for. If the dam would have been built, there were entire plans for how the park area would look today. And it would, of course, be the Tocks Island National Recreation Area built around the reservoir, and the recreational facilities at each one of those entry points for visitors. But in terms of the numbers of people coming in, it's about the same as it is today. So roughly 10 million people, most of those coming from the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area, some from Philly, and then others as well. So the initial inhabitants and takings, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm looking at the deep history of the area and some of the colonial history of the area. So I look at the interaction between the colonists, the early settlers into the area, and the indigenous peoples in the making of America, and sort of how that plays out. And so there's a lot of discussion about ownership and law, and who has the right. And there's a nice parallel here. I spent some time in the Smoky Mountains growing up, so that was really formative for me. And there's a nice parallel here between the work that was happening in Delaware Water Gap and Great Smoky Mountains National Park, because in both of those settings, the government came in and made the decision on the behalf of the people that were living there that they were going to sacrifice their lifestyle in order to create this park-like setting for people from settings in mostly urban areas. So, of course, as you all know, the park that we see today looked very differently in the past in terms of agriculture and development and people living there. So communities, agriculture, the homesteads that were developed, the services that were around, the entire towns that were essentially destroyed through the takings process. And this is where in the interviews that I conducted, I saw a lot more of the discussion about what fair market value was and how that was determined. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt here, or a couple of them from the book, to sort of highlight what was taken and how it was, and basically the unfairness of all of it. So this is from page 154, and this idea that the government didn't pay for it. If you were in the business like my parents, they did not pay you a dime for your goodwill or your business. They did not pay you a dime for your loss of income from the business. The only thing they called fair market value was what they said was the fair market value of the real estate. However, I do not think they were using the true fair market value. I'm not talking about what the real estate agents wanted for the land in the area, or I'm not talking about what woodland was worth, because woodland was worth a very low amount per acre. But the only story that I have behind that is a local real estate agent did have people who were interested in buying my parents' business, just the business, not the extra house that they owned, the property, which was the rental, but they wanted to give them $115,000 for the business. Now, that was probably in the early 1960s, and my mother, who just loved her business, said, no, no, no. When the federal government buys us out, we will rebuild and relocate. Except when the federal government came, they offered them $50,000 around 1964. And if they didn't accept it, they would be condemned for eminent domain, and they would have to accept that unless they fought it in court. And so here's another instance here. What I do remember is that they would come in and talk to her and then set up an appointment, and we came back with a first offer, and it was very low. It was less than $1,000 an acre. So I sat there and said, hey, come on, you can't buy property up here for $1,000 an acre. You're paying 2, 3, and 4. They responded, well, that's inflated prices. We don't pay that. So we said, well, you go back and see what you can do. And they did, and they came back, and finally they got it up to $1,000 an acre, maybe a little bit more. Basically nothing for the house, the barn, or anything else. So we said, well, what if we don't like this offer? And they said, then we go to court. We take it to the courts. And he said, but if you lose in the court, the offer reverts back to the original offer. So you've already lost if you lose in court, and nobody knew how good you would do in court. So she finally decided to take it. It would have been too much for her. She was getting old, and it was just too much for her to go through the experience of court. And in another instance of a lot of these things that were not captured, for any of you that have worked in agriculture, infrastructural development in your homes, to make them better. Emma, in the book, and I'm using pseudonyms here, basically says, I think back to the lady who cried about her rose bushes. But then when you take a place, the average farm had grape arbors. They had many things that were permanently there that produced food. Asparagus will keep on coming. It's amazing. The grapes, I remember you could pick them till the cows come home. It's an expression, but there are no cows there. Peach orchards, apple orchards, pear orchards, go on and on and on. So all of a sudden, when you're going to get out of there within a year, or even if it was 2 years, it wouldn't make it much different. How are you going to find a place that's anywhere near it and have, maybe you can't live long and get it all back together. So she's specifically talking about older people and the life cycles of trees to bear fruit. And I know that the law about eminent domain doesn't ask for too much they're going to pay for. They don't want to hear about what's unique or historic about it or anything of the sort that anybody mentioned. They put a figure on our farm and didn't have to go around house by house, structure by structure, and put a price on it. They just put a lump sum. And so there was this real sense of injustice in terms of the lack of fairness in terms of paying fair price. Now, there were salvage rights that were permitted, but these also went out to bid. There was gutting that occurred. There were squatters that came in, and then, of course, arson in the area, too. And a lot of these historic structures, some that were even recognized by the federal government as historic structures, have not been properly cared for over time. So what are the implications of that? And what is the government responsibility to generations of people that have lived in the area over time? And so there's this sense of continuing distrust of the National Park Service today, but there's also seemingly a decrease in interest in historic preservation. And of course, family associations, historic preservation societies, and the like really are facing an uphill battle in terms of getting the government to properly care for these structures which are recognized as historically significant. And it's a real uphill battle, as I'm sure you're aware of. And the book does highlight some of these responsibilities and also calls on folks that are coming into the area like myself, recent transplants, or even visitors to the area, to learn more about the history of the area, because it's not just any place that can be developed. All of these places have rich histories, memories for people, and the book explores that overall. And so it's about this idea of coming into the place and recognizing the place, and recognizing the sense of loss that was experienced in this place,